just did want to pick your brains on something a little left field, actually. So, a while back, people, I mean, you were very critical of sort of the new atheist figureheads, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, especially critical of Sam Harris and him linking Islamic ideology to fundamentalism and where that might lead us. And it seems over the years, since we've had like the emergence of ISIS, where I can't even count how many number Islamic terror attacks have happened just in my own country. Seems more and more difficult to negate or deny that link between Islamic fundamentalism and outcomes such as suicide bombings, terror attacks, things like that. I was just wondering if you had any sort of change in mind on that, given the emergence of ISIS and what's followed.
Yeah, well, it's a subject I know pretty well. I spent 7 years there in the Middle East. Well, fundamentalists of any stripe, secular, Christian, Islamic, are all cut from the same binary cloth of good and evil, and the ends justify the means. I mean, that's the nature of fundamentalism, but that's not exclusive to Islam. I mean, most Muslims don't embrace that ideology. We're talking about a tiny percentage, but we have Christian fascists or, Christian fundamentalists, and my argument has been the new atheists are just secular fundamentalists, because remember, they signed on for the whole project to bomb the crap out of the Middle East. Not because the Muslims are satanic, the way the Christian right said, but because they're barbarians who don't understand Western civilization. I mean, these people like Harris, they don't understand other cultures. They don't, they're not linguistically, religiously, historically literate. They're responding to a caricature. So are fundamentalists dangerous? Of course, but are fundamentalists somehow, does Islam itself produce fundamentalism? No, not any more than Christianity does. What creates fundamentalism are the social conditions that marginalize people so that they build a kind of ideological justification for their own violence. I mean, you should know that and there are all sorts of studies have been done, most of the members of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, the people who carry out terrorist attacks, don't come out of religious households. They come out of the criminal caste, who then cover themselves with that veneer. And I spent
a lot of sorry to interject, Chris. A lot of them in Europe, especially the UK, have from quite affluent, educated backgrounds, middle class, educated. Some of them teachers, engineers seem to highly correlate with it. It seems like you can have a very well-educated, socio-economically prosperous individual in the West take up Islamic ideology and travel abroad to fight for ISIS or commit a terror attack in the country. Is it not fair to say at least that the link is there?
No,
I mean, is it possible to get from a literal interpretation of Islamic doctrine to acts of extremism?
No, because first of all, the Quran forbids suicide. It's flat out. There's the whole notion that suicide bombing is somehow legitimized by Islam that's completely black and white in the Quran. And when you talk about people like engineers, I covered Al-Qaeda in France, based in Paris after 9/11. What you're talking about, people who don't have a loss of identity. So they were born in one of the banlieues, or they grew up in one of the banlieues outside of Paris. Maybe they, the first few years of a life they spent in Algeria. They're not accepted as French by the French. It's a pretty racist society, like the UK, but they're not accepted back home as Algerians. So this destruction of identity, I think, is what propels them or makes them susceptible to be embraced by these radical fundamentalist groups. I think that is the primary driving factor that pushes into the arms of these people.
Well, that's a fair point. I suppose if we was to accept the UK's racist, we also have people of Indian descent, Chinese, Nigerian. It's quite a diverse population. None of the non-Muslim people who have experienced racism are joining genocidal death cults. So I'm just trying to obviously say you can't generalize about Muslims. Most Muslims are peaceful.
We're not dropping iron fragmentation bombs all over India. We're not demonizing
right. So
Hindus.
I think you're getting right to the heart of my argument. So why would a British-born Muslim have such an attachment to something that was happening in an Islamic country were it not for Islam?
No, it's because of the rhetoric. It's, I don't know how it was in the UK, but after 9/11 in the United States, just to be Muslim was to be considered either a terrorist or a potential terrorist. And that, there are many factors that go into pushing someone into the arms of a radical group like Al Qaeda, identity or loss of identity, lack of identity being one. But the other is the tremendous demonization of culture, religion, which certainly was true in the United States. I'm not defending what they do. I don't like these people. I'm not in any
Oh,
way
obviously.
defending
I mean,
them.
well, what do you make of sort of their official propaganda arm, Dabiq? They released a very helpful document entitled "Why We Hate You and Why We Want to Kill You," something like that. Very on the nose for my liking, but it was very explicit in its reasons for why ISIS existed, and not in there really could you find any grievances about foreign policy or racism. It seemed very much completely wed to these ideas that you can find in Islamic scripture.
But that's not true, Stephen. Have you read the Quran? It's just not true.
I have.
It isn't. Okay, well, I've read it, and I spent 7 years in the Middle East, and I can tell you that what creates people's views towards reality or towards others is based on the society and culture they live in. Because this would be like, there are Muslims in India where men and women worship in the same mosque. I was in Bosnia. I mean, I was in Sarajevo. Those Muslims could drink you and me and any other pub crawling Brit
I
under
am
the
not.
table.
I
I
am
mean,
not worried about Muslims generally. Specifically, Muslims do not keep me awake at all. I just think there is certainly a strain of fundamentalism that you can find from a literal interpretation of the
I
Quran.
don't
Unfortunately, I
think
mean,
fundamentalism doesn't differ. Christian fundamentalists, and I wrote a book called American Fascists, are just as dangerous as Muslim fundamentalists and Hindu fundamentalists. I mean, Hindu fundamentalism itself is very dangerous. The problem is fundamentalism. But there is nothing that I saw as an Arabic speaker, as someone who spent 7 years in the Middle East, there is nothing intrinsic to Islam that leads to fundamentalism any more than there is anything intrinsic in Hindu scripture or Christian scripture that leads to fundamentalism. I did not find it.
so what? Why does Islamic fundamentalism seem to top the world rankings in terms of global terror attacks? And obviously, the next time a bomb goes off in my home city or Europe somewhere, we find out it's a suicide bombing, it'd be pretty certain that that person was a Muslim that carried out that attack.
Yeah, Stephen, it's because they don't have an air force. I mean, if they had an air force, they could bomb the shit out of us, but they don't. So that is their response. And we have to be cognizant of the devastation and death that we spent 20 years visiting on the Muslim world. And to somehow think that there isn't going to be blowback or isn't going to be a response is very naive. It's, in fact, very human. And it has, again, nothing to do with Islam. And it has to do with the aggressive, murderous policies carried out primarily by the United States, but by the NATO alliance against the Muslim world.
I would almost be tempted to agree with you there, but I don't see any sort of Vietnamese terrorist attacks playing out daily in the West, Japanese, for instance. I mean, obviously, the things you would say about the Western forces in terms of who we persecuted, bombed, would ring true, but it doesn't seem to have elicited the same response in terms of terror attacks. It feels like we would have terror attacks from the Islamic world without intervention.
But, Stephen, let's go to Vietnam. I mean, there were all sorts of what would be considered terrorist attacks carried out against U.S. civilians and U.S. troops in Vietnam during the war. All sorts. Tons. I mean,
all right. So no movement.
It's 98% of Muslims in the Muslim world don't like Al Qaeda or ISIS.
I agree, but 100% of Muslim fundamentalists would disagree with your take about the Quran. That's the issue we have to deal with, surely.
Well, you know why? Because they don't actually know the Quran. That is they're not religiously literate. The same way Christian fundamentalists don't know the gospel. And I graduated from seminary. I wrote a book on these people. I spent 2 years with them. They know only those passages that can buttress their ideology. They don't actually know the Bible. They are fed certain snippets or passages that support this murderous ideology by these Christian neo-fascists, in the same way that Osama bin Laden, who has no religious training, no right to issue fatwas, was feeding it to Al-Qaeda. Same thing.
So what's the solution here then? If we have people, young men who have a completely incorrect interpretation of Islam and want to carry out acts of terror, and say they're doing so not in response to sort of foreign intervention or racism or Western foreign policy, anything like that, but because they feel their faith commands it of them, who's that an issue to sort out? Who's the responsibility to fix this
So
problem?
at the end of American Fascists, I said, you want to break this movement, you have to reintegrate these people in society and give them a place in society. And the same is true. It's when I worked in Gaza, 10, 20 young men to a room, no work. They can't leave. It's the world's largest open air prison. Finally, the only way they can affirm themselves is to become a shaheed or a martyr. Because if they do a suicide bombing or they attack an Israeli outpost, then they'll get a big funeral and their pictures will be, at least for a day or two, up on the walls of whatever refugee camp they're from. We have to give them a place. We have to give them a sense of self-worth. And these radical movements will always be attractive when every other avenue is cut off.
All right, Chris, that's a great point to end on. I really appreciate your time. I've really enjoyed agreeing with you, listening to you, disagreeing with you, everything in between.